Hey everybody, welcome back to Ghost Stories. This here's episode 9, The Indian Gallows. The American live oak, one of the most beautiful evergreens, is entwined in the history and legend of the Carolina coastland. Sturdy and majestic, it is said to grow 100 years, live 100 years, and die 100 years. Be that as it may, there are many ancient specimens still beautifying the landscape, and one of them, located in the deep woods of Cullington Island, just west of the Wright Brothers Monument, is the locale of one of the most persistent and touching legends of this storied region. This tree is called the Indian Gallows Tree, and it was one of two live oaks growing within 10 feet of each other. In time, a large limb from one of the trees grew out in the direction of the other tree, and the tip of that limb actually pierced and grew into the trunk of its neighbor, until the entire joinder developed into a huge letter H, with the crossbar or cross limb being a good 10 feet off the ground. This cross limb put out shoots from the top, giving the whole thing the appearance of a garlanded archway, with the top of the arch being almost perfectly level and parallel with the surface of the ground beneath. Thus the trees grew long before our land was formed into a nation, and thus they continued until the early years of the present century, when one of the majestic trees died and was cut and carved into small souvenirs by the people who visited the place and were fascinated by the story connected with it. According to our legend, in 1711, the family of Robert Austin was cast ashore in a shipwreck on the outer banks of what was to become North Carolina. Luckier than most, the Austins were able to salvage many of their worldly goods with the help of a friendly hunting party of Tuscarora Indians. Their lives and their property safe, the survivors began looking for a place to settle and begin the process of carving their homestead out of the lush wilderness. Here again, the Indians were a great deal of assistance, transporting the new settlers in their canoes and pointing out likely locations. Foremost among these newfound friends was the handsome son of the chief of the tribe, a young brave called Prince Roanoke. One of the chief attractions of the English family, at least in the eyes of Roanoke, was the Austins' beautiful daughter, Elnora, a typical English beauty with deep blue eyes, a peaches and cream complexion, and a wealth of long, silky blonde hair. Elnora liked the young Indian prince and valued him as a true friend in this wilderness. But that was as far as it went with her. She was betrothed to one Henry Redwine, who had promised to follow her to the New World and make her his wife, just as soon as he had worked out his apprenticeship to a silversmith and was free to leave England. Finally, a suitable place for the Austins' home was found on the north end of Roanoke Island, and here they began clearing a small patch of ground, setting out net stakes in the nearby sound, and generally making ready to work living out of the land and sea. The weather was mild, and the Indians continued to be friendly, so things began to look bright and hopeful for the little family of settlers in that good year 1711. Prince Roanoke visited the area often, and he and the young and beautiful Elnora took long walks together, communicating as best they could and dreaming the dreams of youth everywhere. Roanoke could not conceal his love for the English maid, and told her of it on one lovely moonlit night as they strolled on the peaceful, wave-lapped shore of the island. She heard him out, and misty-eyed with empathy and understanding, she told him that her heart belonged to her English lover and that she must remain true to her vow. She was bound by her heart as well as her vow to await his coming to the new world and the establishment of their home. Heartbroken and ashamed, Roanoke returned to his home up the mighty river. Hope is the last thing that dies in a man. However, in the months that followed, he returned occasionally to visit with his kin on the island and to talk and walk again with his beloved Elnora. If things were hopeful and bright in the Austen household, they were anything but peaceful in the heart and mind and in the dreams of the old King Cashi, monarch of all the Tuscarora tribes and the father of the young Prince Roanoke. King Cashi hated the intruding whites with all his heart, and he never ceased to dream of the day when they would be driven from his once happy and uncongested hunting and fishing grounds. History now records that it was in the year 1712 that he secretly began to form his Tuscarora Confederacy, adjoining together of the various Tuscarora families with the Corey Indians and the Macaponga Indians to the south and east in a common bond of mistrust of the new settlers and resentment of their presence. Now finally, in 1713, a plan for the massacre of all the whites began to take shape. There were many councils held deep in the woods, where the various chiefs discussed strategy and the chances for winning such a war of extermination. Prince Roanoke knew about these meetings, of course. He even attended some of them. He was familiar with his father's hatred of the white men, but he never really believed anything drastic would result from all these meetings and rantings. He avoided such gatherings when he could find a good excuse. So it befell that the young prince was as much surprised as anyone when he learned that the Tuscarora Confederacy had evolved into a Tuscarora Council of War. A definite plan had been made, and dates had actually been set for a concerted attack on all white settlements and outlying farms in the region. An intricate time schedule had been adopted to coordinate the various attacks. All was to be done by stealth, of course, and every effort was to be made to take the whites by surprise and thus make their annihilation easier. No one man, woman, or child was to be spared. The war was to be treated as a holy war, and all must die. Immediately, Roanoke's thoughts turned to his beloved Elnora, and the certainty of her fate when the raiding band assigned to her island should arrive at her small cabin. King Cashi had planned that his son and heir apparent should take a leading part in the execution of these massacres. But the young brave had quite different intentions. Slipping quietly away at midnight from his father's village up the mighty Chowan River, the young prince crept silently to where he had hidden his small, fast canoe. He shoved it off from the shore, sprang in, and moved out onto the broad bosom of the river, heading downstream as rapidly as his paddle could drive him. He hurried toward the island where his beloved slept, quite unmindful of her grave danger. On and on glided the small boat, with Roanoke trying to conserve his strength, and yet gain as much distance as possible before the growing light of dawn forced him to hide on shore. There he rested and slept until the falling darkness sent him once again on his errand of mercy. Arriving at long last at the island where he had left his beloved, he was startled and dismayed to see tall flames leaping skyward from the direction of the Austen homestead. Hiding his canoe in the tall marsh grass at the north end of the island, the young prince crept stealthily through the woods until he came near the clearing he knew so well. The scene that he had feared to find lay before his eyes. The Austin home and all the outbuildings were aflame, and there in the farmyard, gun in hand, lay the lifeless body of Robert Austin, the shaft of an arrow protruding from between his shoulder blades. A few feet away lay the body of Miss Austin, one arm extended toward her husband, as if in a final effort to help him before the crushing, mangling blow of the tomahawk had ended her dream of the good life in this new world. Neither body had been scalped. The Indians had not yet learned this grisly trick from renegade white men. Elnora was not to be seen anywhere, nor were any of the raiding party in evidence. Unwilling to venture into the clearing from the comparative safety of the forest, Roanoke lay perfectly motionless and silent until the fires burned themselves out and darkness once again enveloped the scene. Still, there was no trace of Elnora or of the raiding Indians. One last chance remained. A little to the south of the northernmost tip of the island, there was a hidden cave right at the water's edge where storm tides had carved out a large hole under the overhanging bank. Roanoke and Elnora had walked there many times during their visits together, and as far as he knew, only the two of them were aware of the cave's existence. With downcast heart and faint hope, the young brave threaded his way through the underbrush until he came to the hidden mouth of the cave. It was pitch black inside and completely silent, but he dared not make a light. With a sigh of despair, he was turning away from the hiding place when he heard a sob, a very human sob, from that dark hole. Rushing to the very end of the cave, he found his Elnora safe and sound, but almost hysterical with grief and fear. Clasping her tightly in his arms, he rocked slowly back and forth and made little comforting noises until she became calmer. Finally, she was able to sob out the account of how she had been at the edge of the clearing when she saw the raiding party of the painted Indians descend on her homestead, kill her mother and father, and set fire to the buildings. In their frenzy and warlust, the Indians had not even seen Elnora in the darkness, and she had run blindly, not even knowing the way she ran, until she found herself at the cave. There she had hidden in mortal terror until the young prince had arrived. Now the young couple was faced with the even greater danger of trying to avoid the raiding Indian war parties who were ravaging the isolated white settlements of the Albemarle. Their only hope lay in reaching Edenton, far up the broad reaches of the Albemarle Sound and the Chowan River. They now knew that capture would mean their torture and death by the traditional Indian method, being burned alive while strapped to a sturdy post or stake. Daylight travel was out of the question. Their sole chance lay in traveling at night and hiding by day. This is exactly what they did. Their first night of travel was made more secure, if much more difficult, by the arising of a great storm. Strong winds and driving rain hid them from spying eyes, but also nearly swamped the little canoe and made it much more difficult to handle. Fortunately, they had a following wind that drove the small craft before it like a ship on the ocean, sometimes almost driving it under the waves, but at other times causing it to plane over the following sea. All that stormy night, the young Roanoke paddled and steered his canoe toward the Chowan while Elnora tried desperately to bail the boat with her cupped hands. It was a wild night. Now, as the cold, gray first light of approaching dawn spread across the eastern sky behind them, they beached their boat on a sand spit that projected from the shore. They disembarked and dragged the canoe up into the shelter of a dense pine forest. Roanoke then went back and with a branch broken from a pine tree carefully walked backward as he wiped from the sand the keel mark of the little boat and the footprints of the travelers. When he returned to the hiding place in the trees, even the most careful searcher would have been unable to tell that anyone or anything had passed that way. Completely spent, the two young fugitives lay down on the forest floor, and cushioned by a centuries-old carpet of pine needles, dropped quickly into the deep sleep of exhaustion. Food was not a problem. They would have been too bone-weary to eat, even if they had food. During the morning, the wind subsided into a gentle southerly breeze, and the rain continued to fall steadily, hissing through the needles of the pine trees and dropping softly to the ground. At sunset, Roanoke awoke, and while Elnora slept, he carefully scouted the area. He found nothing to increase his apprehension, but he did discover some berries and some edible pine tree buds, which he carefully gathered just as long as he could see in the fading light. Returning to the canoe, he found Elnora awake and anxious to continue their journey. After eating their meager meal, the two climbed back into the canoe and resumed their flight toward what they hoped would be safety. It was an hour before daybreak when the headland of Edenton loomed before them. They reached the town wharf just as the townfolk and fishermen were beginning to come out of their houses to begin another day's work. Excitement and indignation buzzed through the little town as the story of the massacre and the flight of the survivors spread like wildfire. Well, did they know, these pioneers in this lush wilderness, that vengeful old King Cashi would not delay long in trying to apprehend any fugitives from his raids and to wipe out the settlement on the banks of the Chowan. Attack, they knew, was imminent. Riding at anchor in the wide harbor of Edenton, there lay a fat merchant ship that had arrived only hours before with a cargo of, among other things, powder and shot and several dozen muskets. It may well have been the passage of that very ship up the waters of the Sound which so frightened the raiding Indians that they did not try to pursue Roanoke and Elnora in their frail canoes. If indeed they had any knowledge of the couple's desperate flight. Wonder of wonders, at least for Elnora, not only did the ship contain supplies and weapons, but it also held the person and her beloved Henry Redwine, free from his apprenticeship, and come to claim his bride and his future in the New World. For Henry and Elnora, happiness was complete. Their sorrow at the death of her parents was softened by the joy of their reunion. Not so, however, for Roanoke. He now saw his last chance of winning the beautiful English girl fade away to nothing. He was also faced with what he knew would be the anger and malice of his own father, King Cashi. He was indeed a man without a family, without a hope for the future. In Edenton, history tells us preparations for defense went forward rapidly. Log walls were erected just outside the town, and redoubts of earth were thrown up to give shelter to the defenders. There were those in the community who looked askance at the presence of the young Prince Roanoke in their midst as all this was going on. But he worked so willingly along with the settlers in the preparation of the defenses, even scouting the nearby forests daily for signs of approaching Indians, that the people began to accept him as their true ally. One by one, the murmurings against him ceased. When the attack finally did come, it was fierce but short-lived. The settlers were too well organized, and their musket fire from behind both log and earthen walls was too devastating for the Indians to bear. They fell back, carrying their dead and wounded with them. What finally broke the spirit of the attackers was a well-placed cannonball from one of the deck guns of the armed merchant ship. The ball landed right in the midst of a group of Indians, killing several and breaking the leg of King Kashi himself. They fell back in disarray and never again seriously threatened Edenton, which continued to be too well armed and disciplined for the forces the Indians could muster thereafter. Although raids on isolated farms continued, the uprising of the Tuscarora Confederacy had just about run its course. There now began for the young Prince Roanoke a most frustrating and sorrowful time. He could not safely return to his own people, and yet he felt very much an outcast in the town of Edenton, forgetting how well he had served them in the recent armed conflict. Many of the whites distrusted him just because he was an Indian. Now, Elnora and her new husband were consistently kind and thoughtful toward the young brave, and did their best to relieve his loneliness, but to little avail. Their very kindness served to deepen the pain of seeing his beloved happily married to another man. Finally, Roanoke decided to take the fateful step that would either solve many of his problems or else end them once and for all. He would return an 18th century prodigal son to his father's tribe. He labored under no illusions about the cruelty of Indian justice. He knew his father's temperament, but after all, he was the only son of the old chief, and he believed that in his own savage way the old man loved him. Days and weeks went by as the young prince prepared himself for his journey of homecoming. He searched the woods with persistence until he found just the perfect specimen of turkey cock to yield the golden bronze feathers for his girdle and a splendid white heron to furnish the head decoration to which he was entitled by tribal law in recognition of his accomplishments as a youth. Prime quality doeskin for his cape and tanned otter feathers for his loincloth were available from local trappers and hunters. Finally, his ceremonial costume was complete and perfect according to Indian tribal protocol. Roanoke looked every inch the chief as he stood on the wooded edge of Oakham Street in Edenton and bade goodbye to his white friends. Tears filled the eyes of the young brave and the newlyweds as they shook hands with friendly palms cupped on each other's shoulders. Finally, with a tremendous heave of his young shoulders, Roanoke turned away from his friends, walked to where his frail canoe floated, and paddled off eastward over the broad bosom of Albemarle Sound. It seems almost certain that the young prince was shadowed from the very start and for almost the entire journey down the Sound. At any rate, when he finally reached his father's village, a committee of young braves was waiting for him. He was roughly seized, carried into the Indian village, and forthwith tied to a man-high stake set deeply into the sand. There he remained without food or drink until nightfall, when the neighboring chiefs began to arrive to convene the court that would decide his fate. Throughout all the day, and during the entire night-long trial that followed, Prince Roanoke uttered never a word. He did not seek to defend himself or to offer excuses or reasons, as subchief after subchief made long, emotional speeches accusing him of traitorous conduct, of being responsible for the failure of their holy war, and of being entirely false and untrue to his father, his tribe, and the Tuscarora Confederacy. One after another, they all demanded that he be put to death for his sins against his people. Some of the orators even went so far as to spit in his face and strike him with their ceremonial gourds. King Kashi uttered not one word in defense of his son. Finally, the vote was taken just as the day began to break over the forest. The decision of the chiefs was unanimous: death to the traitor. Because of the young brave's royal heritage, the chiefs decided to allow the old king to decide the manner of his son's execution. Rising to his feet, with all the glory of the rising sun spreading its light behind him, the ancient and crippled king denounced Prince Roanoke, and with no show of sorrow whatsoever, disclaimed him as a son. He has loved the white man well, intoned the old chief, and he has reaped the reward of the white man's fickleness. Let him therefore not be granted the ancient Indian execution of fire at the stake, but rather the shameful death of the gallows by which the white thieves kill their own criminals. His voice rising to almost an hysterical scream, the vengeful old Cashy spat out, "Let the traitor be hanged by the neck until he is dead, dead, dead." With savage shouts of approval, the Indian braves seized the young prince again. They tore away the deerskin thongs binding him to the ceremonial post and threw them into the sand. With eager haste, they dragged him through the forest by the hair of his head, through brambles and thorns and across little creeks until they reached the giant oaks with the peculiar cross branch between their trunks. Hastily, fashioning a noose of rope, they placed it around Roanoke's neck and threw the other end over the cross branch. They hoisted the bound Roanoke, kicking into the air, and hanged him by the neck until he was indeed dead, dead, dead. Thus ends the legend of the Indian gallows tree. As early as the year 1846, Colonel William H. Rhodes of Bertie County published a poem entitled "The Indian Gallows," which concludes with the Indian trial, as old King Cashy exclaims, "No, not the stake. He loves the pale-faced brothers. Let him die, the white man's death. Come, let us bend a tree and swing the traitor as the red men see the pale-faced villain hang. Give not the stake to him who would the red man's freedom take, who from our fathers and our God would roam, and strives to rob us of our lands and home. They seize him now and drag him to the spot where death awaits and pangs are all forgot." There are those familiar with the area who say that the legend is not ended yet. They say they say that sometimes when the moon is full and the wind is still, you will hear the sound of mourning and keening and weeping, and the little creek that runs by the gallows will run red as blood. All right, everybody, this here's story 2, Blackbeard's Cup. They say that you should never tell a story in the first person. They say that it robs the story of some of its interest and that the teller limits himself unnecessarily. Well, they apparently have never heard of the popularity of true confession magazines and the appeal of the "I was there" approach. Anyway, there are some stories that cannot well be told in any other way. The time was the very early 1930s, right in the middle of the late and unlamented Great Depression. Nag's Head and the remainder of the Outer Banks were still the best kept secret in North Carolina. There were miles and miles of undeveloped beaches on both the Sound and the ocean sides of the famous Barrier Reef, and the whole area was as close to being a modern-day Garden of Eden as it could be. I was at the time a student in the law school of the University of North Carolina and already a veteran of nearly 20 summers of roaming on and loving the Outer Banks. Also in the same law school at the time was a young man who shall be known here as only Jack, to preserve his anonymity. He also was an habitue of this golden strand since childhood, and was a member of one of the finest families in eastern North Carolina. At that time, Jack was even more conversant with the legends of the region than I, particularly the regions around Ocracoke and Portsmouth Island. A lifelong friendship had grown between us, and we, young blades, spent countless happy and carefree days exploring these sands and drinking to the full the mystery and wonder of the area. This was the picture on the happy August day when Jack came to me and said Charlie, I hope you've got $10 to spare because that will be your share of the cost of hiring a gas boat to take us to Ocracoke tomorrow, as well as board and lodging for one night. I hadn't known we were going to Ocracoke at all, much less on the morrow, but at that age in life, there was theirs was not to reason why. After all, what was there to lose besides a lazy summer day? It put a tremendous dent in my pocketbook, but I just happened to have that amount on hand, so without question, the deal was made and the trip planned. I had no idea what Jack had in mind, but a trip to Ocracoke was pleasant at any time, and even then the price seemed a bargain. Why not a car? In those days, very few people could afford a car, and most of the ones who were affluent enough to try the trip overland and inlet usually got stuck in the sand. The ferries were adequate for the traffic at the time, but such an undertaking was fraught with danger and delay and frequent calls to the Coast Guard for an overland rescue. No, a boat was slower sometimes, but usually very pleasant and more dependable. Given the wind direction and force and the type and location of the clouds, you could estimate the time of your arrival at any given point on Albemarle or, or Pamlico Sounds with fairly reasonable accuracy. The next day dawned clear and mild, and an early departure from the long pier jutting out from Hollowell's store and post office into the Sound was made with high spirits and keen anticipation. There was no shade or awning on the Dutch net boat we had hired, and no relief from the blazing August sun. But all the voyagers were young and strong and already tanned a deep mahogany, so it made little difference. After all, who knew what adventure might lie ahead? We had practically no money to spare, but we were young and almost distinguishingly healthy, and it was summer, and we were at Nag's Head. The copious lunch we took along was consumed before the sun reached the zenith, and the trip southward was without notable event. After we ate, we rescued some chicken bones from the drumsticks, threaded them onto hooks, attached a crab line we found in the boat, and trolled for bluefish. We caught a fairly nice mess of fish, which we gave to our skipper. Ocracoke landfall was made well before dark, and the smooth water of Silver Lake beckoned us to a safe landing at the pier. The short walk to the Pamlico Inn was rewarded by the usual cordial welcome from the Gaskills, and we settled in for supper. After a bountiful seafood supper, we stepped out into the gathering dusk of a beautiful Ocracoke evening and breathed deeply of the soft, salty breeze which was coming in from the eastwards. Up to that point, I had not known that there was any special purpose to our journey, just a trip down to Ocracoke, with all its nostalgic sights and sounds and smells, was reason enough, not to mention the wonderful people who were part and parcel of it all. Pleasures were simple at that time and in that place, but they were deep and soul satisfying. Even in those days, it was like stepping back into history. That was part of the magic of Ocracoke. "Come on," said Jack. "We don't want to be late." When I demanded to know where we were going, he said, "To the castle." "Are you crazy?" I asked. "Shell Castle is out yonder in the middle of the Sound, and Jasper, our skipper, won't be back until tomorrow morning." "Take it easy, Chuck," he replied. "There's more than one castle around here, and the one we're going to is Blackbeard's castle. Come on with me." On we went down the picture-book streets of the town in the direction of Silver Lake. There were places where the branches of the trees met overhead, forming a sort of fragrant tunnel, through which we walked. Jack apparently knew the way, and it seemed to me we walked a good while before we came to a large, white clapboard house with a sort of cupola or lookout tower on top, overlooking the waters of the Sound. "This is it," whispered Jack. Look alive now and do exactly as I do, and we may see something very few people ever get to see." Walking across the broad front porch, Jack knocked 3 times on the huge door with his clenched fist. The door swung slowly open, just enough for me to see a large, lantern-lit room and the silhouette of a tremendous, bearded man peering cautiously out of the cracked door. "What is it you want?" growled the giant. To my amazement, Jack immediately answered, "Death to Spotswood." The eyes of the bear flashed to me. "And you?" he asked, flabbergasted. I stammered the same thing Jack had said, or as close to it as I could manage. That, apparently, was some sort of password, because the heavy door swung open and we walked in. Only my unwillingness to leave Jack in such a spot prevented me from bolting from the door and back to the inn as fast as I could run. The room we entered had obviously been used at one time as a dining room or banquet room. With high ceilings and beautiful wood paneling, its only furnishings now consisted of a very large oak table in the middle of the room, surrounded by a number of rather modern-looking bentwood chairs. The only illumination came from a huge kerosene lantern placed in the middle of the table. Its soft, warm light revealed about a dozen of the biggest, toughest-looking men I have ever seen. Most of them were heavily bearded with flashing blue eyes, and every one of them spoke with that Elizabethan inflection so usual on this coast, which has been called hoy-toy talk. As the first order of business, Jack and I were required to place our hands on a large Bible and to take a solemn oath that under penalty of death we would not reveal anything that went on in that room that night for 35 years. With a shiver of mixed anticipation and apprehension, I took the oath and settled back into one of the chairs near the table. Jack did likewise. The others in the room did not take the oath, but they took similar seats, and for a short while we heard nothing but the buzz of several different conversations. All at once, and as though on signal, an abrupt silence engulfed the room as the door at the far end swung slowly open, and the bearded giant who had admitted us strode in, holding aloft a large silver cup of a most peculiar shape. Handing it to the man at the head of the table, he sat down, and the man holding the cup raised it ceilingward, and in a deep resonant voice chanted, "Death to Spotswood," the same phrase that had gained us admission to the house. So saying, he took a long draught of the liquid in the cup and passed it to the man next to him, who did the same thing and said the same words. The cup then was passed from hand to hand around the table until it came to me. Thrusting the cup against chest, my neighbor fixed me with a stare so fierce and so demanding that my knees began to quiver. Too afraid to do anything else, I lifted the cup as I had seen them do, and in the lowest voice I could muster, repeated the words. Lowering the cup, I drank a large swallow of the amber liquid. My mouth and throat burned as if on fire. I gagged and coughed and finally managed to swallow, while the eyes of all the group that were upon me. The stuff had not seemed to bother them at all. While the silver cup was in my hands and before I passed it to Jack, I noticed it was of a very peculiar shape, much larger than any drinking cup or chalice I had ever seen. It was nearly so large as a punch bowl and was relatively shallow for its width. At 2 places on its lip, there were cup-shaped depressions in the edge about 3 inches apart, which sloped inward and made drinking from that side of the cup very difficult. I had quickly discovered that the potion we were drinking was some of the strongest corn whiskey I had ever sampled. It had a kick like a Missouri mule, and that first swallow almost floored me. Well, the evening wore on, and the cup made round after round of a huge table. Frankly, I was scared not to take my part in the goings-on, but I took as small sips of the potent liquor as I thought I could get by with. After a few rounds of the table, the talk loosened up and became more informal, and that night I heard some of the wildest tales about Edward Teach, the pirate, you could imagine. By that time, we were on a first-name basis, but I never once heard the surnames of any of those present. Fairly early in the evening, I was enlightened to the fact that the oblate spheroid shape of the cup was due to the cup's being the silver-plated skull of Blackbeard himself. I became a little queasy when it dawned on me that if the cup was a skull, then the little drips in its lip had to be the eye sockets. Carved in rather rough Elizabethan letters around the outside of the cup were the words, "Death to Spotswood." Just how long the wild tales in the loving cup lasted, I have no idea. Jack and I made the excuse that we needed to go outside to get some fresh air. Once outside, we made the best speed we could to our lodgings and an exhausted sleep. Jasper was back with his gas boat bright and early the next morning, and we made our way northward to Nag's Head and a safe landing on the sound side. Little did we know that Blackbeard's castle and the Pamlico Inn and the Wahab house would be either destroyed or damaged beyond repair by the hurricane that struck Ocracoke in 1944. But such was to be the fate of these and several other well-known buildings on that historic island. Afraid to discuss our adventure in front of Jasper, Jack and I waited until we were ashore before we started talking it out. We figured the oath did not forbid us our discussing it with one another, only with non-participants. It turned out that Jack was almost as ignorant of what the strange affair meant and how it came to be as I was. A long-time banker friend had given him the password and told him when and where to show up if he wanted to see something he probably would never see again. Acting on the trusted word of that friend, Jack had led us into the adventure. We had both heard many times that Blackbeard's severed head had been coated with silver and made into a punch bowl and used by some Virginia families. We knew, of course, that the royal Governor Spotswood, who had brought about Blackbeard's death, refused to return to England after his term of office expired because he feared, and probably rightly, that Blackbeard's friends, the Brethren of the Coast, would learn of it, intercept him at sea, and avenge the death of their friend and leader. We kept our oath, Jack and I. At least I feel sure that he did, and I know that I did. It has now been more than 50 years, and I figure I have done my part to keep their confidence. I can see no harm and no oath violation in disclosing this now. I don't even know whether any of the party who met that night is alive, but I do know the castle was no longer there. In the trials and tribulations of pursuing a career in the law, the memory of the schoolboy adventure almost faded from my memory. One day recently, I was looking through some old books I had inherited, and I came across Cressy's Grandfather's Tales of North Carolina History, which was written back in the 1800s and was published by Edwards and Broughton. The author, Richard Benbury Cressy, lived closer to Blackbeard's time than we do, and he had devoted a section to the pirate. A perusal of the book proved Cressy to be a very accurate and a very complete portrayer of the history of this state. In his chapter on Teach, he writes, Teach had 17 desperate men under him. Maynard had more than 30. The engagement was desperate. By a feint, Maynard's men were sent below, and Teach was made to believe that Maynard declined the fight and was about to surrender. When Teach saw this, he sailed to Maynard's ship to take possession of her. As soon as he boarded, Maynard ordered his men on deck, and then it was a hand-to-hand fight. Maynard and Teach heading it with sabers. Now Teach was mortally wounded after he had wounded 20 of Maynard's men. After Maynard had captured Teach's sloop, he cut off his head, fastened it to his bowsprit, and sailed up to the Bath in Beaufort County, then Hyde. No mention here of carrying the head back to Virginia. And remember, Bath was Blackbeard's hometown. A great majority of the people there were his friends, including Governor Eden. In fact, Eden had performed Blackbeard's marriage ceremony just weeks before when he took a local bride. Maybe the severed head did not go to Virginia after all. Maybe it was rescued by some of the many friends of the pirate, and maybe it was them or some local silversmith who fashioned it into a silver cup bearing the curse on Spotswood. Perhaps the account of a punch bowl being made from the skull was a garbled one. What human has ever had a skull big enough to be used as a punch bowl? Maybe that odd-shaped, shallow bowl from which I drank was indeed the genuine article. Remember the secrecy with which it had been displayed, and remember the location. Was it really the skull bowl? I had to find out. From that day to this, I have tried, as opportunity arose, to trace the whereabouts and ownership of the bowl. Twice I thought I was on the verge of finding it, once in Norfolk and once in Virginia Beach, only to have the trail go cold. Both times it was rumored to be the property of a very rich Virginia collector, but when I tried as discreetly as I could to find him, I ran into a solid wall of silence. I have discussed this search with my internist, a medical man in whom I have the utmost confidence, and he also has become interested. He tells me that if I can obtain possession of the object for only a few hours, he will help me have it x-rayed to determine if indeed there is a human skull underlaying the silver plating. Before I meet my maker, I would greatly like to determine whether the silver bowl from which I drank is truly the skull of a famous pirate. The only way I know to do this is to obtain the cup so that it may be x-rayed, even if I am supervised and even if it is a brief loan. In one final effort to do exactly that, I made this offer. I will pay $1,000 in cash to the person who loans me the cup from which I drank, and I promise I will keep it just long enough to have it x-rayed. I will post a bond for its safe return, and I pledge never to reveal the name and or address of the owner. There is no chance of a counterfeit being run in on me. I held the cup in my hands, and I drank from it, and I shall immediately recognize it if I ever see it again. My friend Jack has long ago passed to his reward, or I would certainly enlist his help in the search. Maybe, from where he is now, he already knows whether the cup is the genuine article, but I surely would like to know. I surely would.